says, oh, shit. Who is this guy? Some surveyor from Wales has beaten me to the punch, And so he I don't suppose he got on the phone, but he sent a message with a servant to Charles Lyell, who was his great friend and the president of the Royal Society at that time, and said, Charlie, this is a real problem. I'm bringing this book out. This guy, some clown, this guy looks like he scooped me. And Lyell said, don't worry, here's what we'll do. We'll get him to deliver a paper at the Royal Society, and we'll have you deliver a paper the same evening. And you know how everybody adjourns to get drunk at the intermission, so we'll just schedule him after the intermission. And this was done. And this is why Charles Darwin is the discoverer of evolution. For a few decades, it was called the Darwin-Wallace theory, but eventually, it's an interesting story, although not relevant to what we're doing, but what overturned, well, somewhat relevant, the reason Wallace became persona non grata in English science was because he would not genuflect before pure reductionism. He said there is more to evolution than mutation and natural selection. There is a spiritual element, and that was all it took for him to get the boot, because 19th century scientific theory in biology was absolutely phobic of deism, belief in God. They were really far more committed atheists than I would wager most of us are. It was a point of pride with them to squeeze spiritual assumptions out of all of their theories. There is no purpose recognized in Darwinian evolutionary theory. To speak of purpose in their minds was to completely misunderstand what was being suggested, and what they wanted was a theory of how life could evolve and come to be that would be specifically without purpose, because the only kind of purpose they could imagine was God's plan, and they wanted to dump that whole idea. It was a very fierce intellectual struggle. As the inheritors of the victory, we don't really realize what a desperate struggle that was. I mean, as recently as 120 years ago, you could call yourself a member of the British intelligentsia, and you could believe that the Earth was created at 10 a.m. on September the 6th, 2344 BC. That was educated Christian opinion in England as recently as 120 years ago. So we have made considerable intellectual progress, at least. They calculated, they read the Bible, all those begats, and the ages of each person. So-and-so lived to be 120 years, and he begat so-and-so, and they added it all up, and that was the date.
Misplacement of their own time wave.
Well, yeah. They had an incredibly limited view of the possibility of cosmic time. This is an intellectual revolution that has taken place almost within our lifetimes. People had no idea how old the world was and how old human beings were. I mean, that was as far as the imagination of Western Europe could be stretched, to the idea that the Earth was 4,500 years old. At the turn of the century, when these French peasants were out digging truffles or feeding their goats or something, and they fell into the hole that led to the Lascaux paintings, and they saw all these, the bison and the deer and these amazing paintings, said, this is really important. Let's get let's tell the experts in Paris. So the great experts on the art of Europe came and down and lowered themselves into this cave and viewed all this stuff, and then announced to the Paris newspapers that this stuff was not old, that in their expert opinion, these things had probably been done as a kind of amusement by French soldiers in the Grand Army of Napoleon who overwintered there in 1812, you know. So they were saying it's basically less than 100 years old from their vantage point. These things were 20 to 25,000 years old. And as this dawned, this realization, this is the discovery of deep time. The idea that the Earth could be 4 billion years old, you know. These were astonishing intellectual revolutions of which we're the inheritors, and we've sort of grown up with these assumptions. But they are very, very recent leaps in the evolution of the European imagination. That's right. Oh, yeah. We're a country of rattlesnake-handling screwballs. I mean, every time I go to Europe, it amazes me the great difference between Europe and the United States is that it's a secular society over there. You know, they have transcended fundamentalism pretty thoroughly. And so discussions about social mores or drugs or stuff like that can go on without invoking concepts like God's wrath and Jesus' plan and stuff where you just, you know. Anyway, enough of Sunday morning raving. Yes?
On the time wave, how much can you say that the time wave actually relates to the individual? Particularly if you're getting down into our own time on the time wave, can the individual, we didn't get that far down into the time wave yesterday. I take it that the time wave is actually fixed.
Yes,
for everyone,
right. Well, so the big wave, the wave we were looking
at. The big
at.
wave is, how much can it then relate to the individual in terms of, you know, if you look at it, if you zoom on down.
Right. That's an interesting question. I sort of feel, I see, and I've worked out the theory of how it could be applied to the individual, but I'm a little less comfortable with it. I don't hear the logos booming in my ears when I did that part of the work. Astrology underwent a kind of similar crisis, if you want to put it that way. Originally, astrology was to chart basically the course of reigns of kings, and kings were assumed to be macrocosms of society. So really, astrology was created to chart the destiny of nations and peoples. In the Renaissance, with the birth of the idea of the individual, really, people for the first time began to think of, well, what about my horoscope, you know? And really, I think the evolution of the personal horoscope, although I'm sure astrologers will rise in a single body to shout this down, but the rise of the individual horoscope is essentially a capitalist phenomenon where you then create a product that can be dealt, because if you're only casting horoscopes for the court, pretty soon there aren't too many horoscopes needing to be cast. The way you do it with the time wave, if you want to get your individual wave, is the way I think of the big wave that we looked at yesterday is that it is, in a sense, the average of all the little waves, that we each are a little wave, and when you average them all together, you get the big wave, sort of the way if you have enough atoms of gold and you put them together,